Whenever nutrition guidelines change, the reaction is almost immediate, and it's usually louder than the truth. So instead of reacting emotionally, let's calm down and take a look at what's actually being said when it comes to our food, and look at this from a non-ideological perspective and eliminate any type of partisan political conversation. Because what matters with the new food guide pyramid is how it's affecting the body, and is it supporting your ability to thrive and heal. The new food guide pyramid has just recently been released, and I thought instead of taking a side for or against it or trying to defend anyone in their position, I thought what would be more interesting is to look at what the commentary has been around it. From clinicians, from dietitians, the established nutrition community, from the agriculture world, and even what the public as a whole is saying. And what I've noticed is that there are 5 consistent responses that just seem to keep coming up. Now, if you've been looking at this new food guide pyramid and you've been feeling confused anyway, well, just know that you're not alone. And one thing worth noting as we get into this conversation today is the difference just at an initial high-level view of what's different from the original food guide pyramid to now. And I think one of the things that we have to look at with the previous food pyramid to make sense of what's being said about it is that the previous food guide pyramid was very rigid in its presentation. If you'll notice when you look at that, every food group was isolated to a fixed section. And what that implied is that there is a percentage of that food group that you should be consuming. Ultimately, it communicated to you that the structure of your diet should be very rigid, should have very little in the way of flexibility. Just the general presentation of the new food guide pyramid is much different. You'll notice when you look at that there are no hard blocks. There aren't these strict sections that we saw in the prior version. And what that suggests is the ability to move around in that food pyramid. It prioritizes not a food grouping, but it prioritizes the ability to shift based on the individual and based on need. Ultimately, the communication is more one of flexibility. And this aligns with how individuals in general eat. The reason that this matters physiologically, and the reason I'm going to tie this in and I'm using this as a starting point, is because different individuals have different bodies, obviously. You have different metabolic needs. You have different stressors, different factors in your life that you have to account for. And everyone has different health pictures, again, that shift at different phases of life. That requires flexibility and not a rigid set of rules to try to follow. So with that backdrop in mind, let's move now into what's being said consistently about the new food guide pyramid. 5 responses keep showing up. Number 1 is a praise for the move towards real whole foods. Number 2 is support for the recentering of proteins and animal foods, meaning there's just more emphasis in this new food guide pyramid for that food grouping. The third is that there's pushback from parts of the nutrition establishment. That would be expected. Number 4 is that there's renewed criticism of saturated fats, which tends to drag along with it red meat. And number 5 is that there's concerns about cost, access, and equity with the layout of this new food guide pyramid. Now, some of these deserve agreement. Some of them are going to deserve correction, and some are going to require a much bigger conversation than is currently being had. The first talking point that keeps popping up is that this new food guide pyramid is aligning with more real food and whole food intake. And you just have to look at this and do an easy comparison between the prior version and this version and agree that that's exactly what it's doing. The prior version leaned into more processed foods. Some of these could even be ultra-processed foods, but this whole notion of consuming ultra-processed foods has driven inflammation, it's driven metabolic dysfunction, and we see metabolic stress and immune challenges as a part of that. Therefore, when you look at this new food guide pyramid, this shift is not a radical shift like it's being touted in some ways, it's honestly more of a corrective shift. And when you look at this and you think about food and what food actually delivers, too often the conversation is simplified down to food as calories. Calories do matter here, but it can't be limited to that. More importantly, we should be viewing food as biological information, not just as calories. It goes beyond the fats, the proteins, and the carbohydrates. There's micronutrients there, there's secondary metabolites, and all of these are giving signals to the body, to the microbiota in the gut. Food is information, and we have to lean into that mindset. And therefore, when we do it, it only makes sense that we would consume real food. And that also brings up the question of food quality. How important is food quality? And this is when you think about food quality begins so far ahead of when you go to and visit the grocery store or what you see on a label in a store. If you just think differently about food and look at food as a non-inert substance, meaning that food is not benign. It's not innocuous. Food is going to have either a positive or negative impact on the body, and you have to make a decision of which side of that you're going to fall onto. And this new food guide pyramid helps individuals fall more on the positive side of that. Every time you make a choice, remember, choices have consequences, and food is a choice. Therefore, when you're choosing food, there's either going to be a positive or a negative consequence to that food consumption. And this new food guide pyramid, this is just an effort to more effectively line up with the reality of where we need to be with food intake in general. The second point that keeps popping up is that there's a recentering of protein and inclusion of more animal foods in this new food guide pyramid. Think about protein here for a minute. Let's examine what protein is. Protein is a foundational macronutrient. It's important for blood sugar. It's important for structural development in the body, whether that's muscle, bone, the organ tissues, their ability to heal and regenerate, your immune system, surveillance, the ability of the immune system to respond in an effective manner and do it over and over again. Protein has a very significant hand to play in that, and even just the ability to age effectively, meaning physically how we age and cognitively how we age, that can be influenced by protein. And many individuals, and I'll underscore women when I make this comment, underconsume protein. Therefore, there's certainly an increased opportunity to raise protein consumption to harness more benefit from it. Maybe one of the most important recommendations in the new food guide pyramid is that there's almost double the intake of protein that is being recommended. And this isn't about eating more meat or just eating protein more, blindly, not just haphazardly consuming more. This is about doing that with intention. And one of the things that I appreciate as a part of this conversation, especially because it includes animal-based foods, is that there's a distinction with quality. RFK, if you look at his communications publicly as he's been kind of moving through this position that he has now, one of the things that he's acknowledged is that regenerative ranching and farming certainly has a more important place than what has previously been stated about it. And it's ultimately because it is a different mindset around agriculture that promotes quality over just quantity and convenience. The third talking point is coming from the nutrition establishment, and there's obviously some pushback from this grouping. They're stating that there are concerns that there's the implementation of confusion, that there's deviation from what the consensus has been with this new food guide pyramid. But one thing you have to look at here and think about is that consensus doesn't necessarily equal correctness. Those two aren't inherently aligned with each other. And when you look at many of these older guidelines, they're built on observational data. This is not the most solid footing to be making recommendations on, and it's certainly not clinical trials. And if we even just step back and look at this at the population level, there's been the increase in chronic disease under these recommendations. That in and of itself would draw some of these recommendations into concern and into question. I'll pick one of these just to give you an example on this. There's been concerns, we were just talking about protein, there's been concerns about whether or not the new recommendations are necessary for the general population. One of the members of the nutrition establishment, if you will, went on to say that, especially given that most Americans already consume more than the minimum protein requirement. Well, here's the problem with that. That statement assumes that minimal is optimal. Minimum is not optimal. That's not where your body is flourishing at. And also, if the current guidelines and recommendations, if they haven't improved the outcomes over the past several decades, then it's time for a reevaluation. It's time to look at something different and stop protecting what is not leading individuals towards optimal health and the ability to thrive. Talking point number 4 is this renewed vigor in the attack on saturated fat and red meat. And I always find this conversation a bit comical because it just clearly illustrates that much of the data that has continued to come out over the last 5+ years is not being acknowledged, and it's certainly not being implemented in the guidelines. And when you're villainizing a macronutrient like this, even a subset of a specific macronutrient, so the macronutrient being fat, and then we're villainizing saturated fat, versus say monounsaturated or polyunsaturated. The point here is that when you're doing that, that is a gross oversimplification. You're picking one facet of the diet and villainizing that one facet of the diet. Saturated fat does not get consumed alone, thus it does not act in isolation. You have to factor in what the overall context is. For example, insulin status, how's someone's overall metabolic health, how's their glucose regulation, and what is the overall food matrix that saturated fat is being consumed within. Is it being consumed as part of a diet that's extremely high in ultra-processed foods, or is it being consumed as part of a real diet, maybe with some red meats, that looks totally different? The problem here is that you can't just swap out one section of the diet and expect that that's going to completely change someone's overall metabolic picture, meaning that you can't just yank out saturated fats and put in just monounsaturated fats and expect that it's going to be completely different. If the inclusion of the processed foods didn't change, the likelihood that that individual's overall health picture is going to change is pretty well nullified as well. And when you look at things like animal foods, let's pick that specifically since that's where this is predominantly coming from. Whole food animal foods do not behave the same when they're consumed as fats. When you're consuming that as your fat source, that's not going to behave the same as those ultra-processed foods. So it really draws into question if saturated fat is bad. Well, when you're asking that question, what is bad, first of all, but it's bad compared to what and in whom and in what scenario, right? The other thing that comes to mind for me on this, and to me, this might be one of the most important and eye-opening of all facts of this, is that it's ignoring data that comes from, for example, like a 2020 study from the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. Listen to where that just came from the cardiology journals, and how often do we hear that saturated fat is an increased risk factor for cardiovascular disease. I'm not a fan of reading stuff to you, but I think if you listen to what I'm getting ready to say, this is just so eye-opening that you really can't even take someone serious when they start talking about this saturated fat conversation. This study goes on to say in the abstract, whole fat dairy, unprocessed meat, and dark chocolate are saturated fatty acid rich foods with a complex matrix that are not, I repeat, not associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Can't say it much more plainly than that. The totality of available evidence does not support further limiting the intake of such foods. We should be consuming these foods. They're necessary. It goes on to say, it is also important to note that the health effects of foods cannot be predicted by their content in any nutrient group without considering the overall macronutrient distribution. We really don't need to say any more. The fifth and final talking point that keeps coming up is that there's going to be a problem with access, cost, and the overall hypocrisy with this new food guide pyramid. And we do need to acknowledge a couple of realities up front about this and just be fair to both sides of the conversation. Yes, food quality does cost more up front. There's no ignoring that. That's just a fact, and we have to accept that and move on past it. And access is uneven. That too is true, okay? But there's also some contradictions that come to light in this conversation as well that seem to not be talked about as much, that are really the thrust of the conversation here. One is that we subsidize food in the United States, and it's not the best quality food. The next thing is that we subsidize healthcare. And the final point here is that within that healthcare model, we are subsidizing disease. If you look at all of those facts together, it is absolutely illogical to subsidize foods that create disease and then turn around and subsidize the treatment of that disease. That doesn't make sense. That's an illogical continuum that continues to play out. But there is a different solution to look at this, but it also requires a different way of thinking. And that solution is that we could redirect these subsidies towards nutrient-dense real food and help with the accessibility of that real food. And by doing that, we could eliminate the downstream healthcare cost and maybe even more importantly, the disease and the lifestyle crippling effects that come along with that. But it begins with a mindset shift, and ultimately it is going to take some sacrifice on the front end to get that higher quality food into the hands of the individuals that may not inherently have access to it. But we can do that. And when you begin to think about food in more of a survival mode and realize that if we're going to fund survival, then we might as well fund nourishment along with that survival. That makes far more sense than just trying to promote more caloric intake. The new food guide pyramid, it's not perfect, but it does open a conversation that should have been had literally decades ago. And if we start to think more in terms of food quality and not just rules or trying to meet certain caloric requirements, this creates an entirely different view of how we should be thinking about food. Now, as a part of this video, I did mention a couple of times about protein. And if you want to understand why protein plays such a central role in how your body feels and functions, well, if there's another video here where I break this down clearly for you. And once you understand protein physiology, a lot of confusion around nutrition, it starts to clear up.